good morning, everyone. Good morning, good day. Anyway, good to see you, everyone. Thank you for joining this event. First of all, before introduction, etc., I would like to inform you that this meeting is going to be recorded so that we deal with the GDPR-related issues first. So your attendance is considered as accepting the fact that the meeting is recorded. Yeah. So, welcome again. I am Simone Vannuccini. I'm a lecturer in economics of innovation at SPRU, the University of Sussex, and together with Frederic Bone, who is going to chair the second part of this event and just said hello. We are the conveners of what is the University of Sussex Business School and SPRU interest group, or what we call the mobilizer group on artificial intelligence. And as one of the initiatives of this group, we organized the inaugural event of a series of yearly lectures dedicated to AI that somehow want to suggest that this is an important research topic, and we as University of Sussex want to dedicate attention and allocate effort to research in this direction. The first lecture will be given by Professor Ed Steinmueller that I'm going to introduce in a second, but first of all, who also says hi. A couple of rules of the game. So as you know, the events on Zoom are both enabling and producing challenging. So for example, there are now more than almost 90 people connected. So usually we ask everybody to be muted, even though we would suggest for at least the first part of the event, the lecture of Ed, that you might even stay unmuted if you want to react to the contents of the lecture. So feel free. What we would ask you is to, if you want, is to also keep the camera on, in a sense that this helps to build some feeling of community and being, even if distributed around the world, a bit closer. The event is also the first event of the season of the traditional SPRU 3-month seminars. So it's a joint event. And but compared to the usual 3-month seminar, it is a longer one. So this event is split in 2 parts that will last until 3:30 p.m. UK time. The first part, or part A, is the lecture of Ed Steinmueller, and then after some Q&A and a brief break, we will have a workshop or panel with what we call three young, or somebody has suggested middle-aged, but anyway, let's say still rising stars in the world of AI research, widely considered. So we have Katia Bego from Nesta, we have Juan Mateus Garcia also from Nesta, and Beatrice Fazzi from the School of Media Arts and Humanities here at the University of Sussex. So 3 very interesting, I can anticipate 3 very interesting interventions on the idea or on the topic of the arrival or not of a potential new AI winter. And finally, there will be also a summary from a group work of SPRU that includes Frederic Bone, Maria Savona, Tommaso Charli, and myself, that has been working a little bit on thinking about potential research trajectories for AI research. And this will be toward the end of the event. There will be hopefully plenty also of opportunity for discussing. However, I would ask you, given the numbers, so you can, if you have questions, you can start posting the question in the chat, and we will try to collect them and to feed them to Ed first and then to the other speakers. Some questions might be pulled for convenience, but we try to be inclusive as much as we can. And then I think that is all. The lecture that is titled Imagining AI in Business, the Laboratory and the Fiction, is from Professor Ed Steinmueller, that is the Phillips Chair at the of Economics of Innovation, of Information and Communication Technology at SPRU and the University of Sussex. But without further ado, as he suggested, is also the person that has been studying and being interested in the topic of AI since a long time. So I just leave the floor to him, and thanks Ed and everybody for joining and for this opportunity.
Thank you, Simona. I will try to share my screen here. Hopefully you see it now. Now, what I suggested that you might not mute yourself in the idea that if you're in a quiet room, as I am, then indeed we might achieve a little bit more live effect if we have an audience that's actually audible. Some of this is intended to provoke some laughter, and it's of course a problem if you tell a joke and no one makes any reaction. So if you don't mind being listened to while you're listening to me, don't hesitate to not mute yourself, to unmute yourself. Right? Okay, so I think some people have unmuted, and so far we have tolerable background noise, that is almost none. So I'm going to proceed from there. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk today about imagining AI in business, the laboratory, and in fiction. This is meant to be an overview with ideas more than it is meant to be an analytical or empirically driven presentation. So let me begin. If I can, there we go. So we begin with imagination, which will play a central role in my remarks. Human imagination is a fundamental driver of innovation. This is sort of an anodyne statement. It's not very controversial. About the best one can offer in rebuttal to this is that some things we can imagine are beyond our capacity to invent, and some things we can invent are beyond our capacity to commercialize. And of course, it remains true that most innovation is incremental. Incremental innovation requires imagination, but perhaps it follows more closely Edison's rule: 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. These are themes that we'll return to a couple of times in the course of today. Imagination is also linked to expectations. You might recall Keynes's remark about animal spirits. Our decisions to do something positive can only be taken as the result of animal spirits, a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction, and not as the outcome of a weighted average of quantitative benefits multiplied by quantitative probabilities. With apologies to economists in the audience who might believe the latter is the driver of investment dynamics. So a major source of these animal spirits is imagination. And this leads to my second claim: imagination about the intelligence of AI is more important than the nature of AI intelligence. And you see, humans are fond of attributing consciousness to others, to other humans, to other living creatures, to supernatural beings, for example, God or gods, to apparently inanimate objects. It's not surprising, therefore, that developing machines able to perform activities that we associate with consciousness would lead people to imagine they were conscious. But does this matter? And if so, how? So most of you will know of Alan Turing's test for intelligence, in which a human is confronted with a screen and a keyboard that can be used to chat. Turing proposed that if the human was unable to distinguish between a human and an AI chatting with them, then the AI could be said to be intelligent. This thought experiment highlights that for many applications, the performance of actions we imagine to require intelligence is synonymous, in at least in perception, with intelligence. To pass the Turing test, we need only to devise an AI that is very good at imitating what is perceived to be intelligence. But don't stop there. An AI that can perform as if it was conscious will be imagined to be conscious by virtually all humans. So in that sense, this question of consciousness is partially a separate question than the question of what people would imagine to be true. I like this little cartoon here in which the Turing text extra points is that if the computer could convince the human that they're not human. So other people may talk more about this. I think Juan will have further remarks, but very briefly, artificial intelligence is a label applied to a program of research that spans computer science, neurosciences, psychology, and linguistics. From the early days of digital computers, this research program has pursued, with little success, the goal of thinking machines, sentience, or consciousness. More recently, however, because of advances in computational power and architecture, that is, neural networks, there has been substantial improvement in the imitative and predictive performance of systems. In this context, higher AI performance means approaching or exceeding human performance in a task. That is, acting as if the machine was human, performing as if it was human in terms of performing the task. The results that have been achieved rely on large data sets, big data with reliable observations within them that is used to train the AI algorithm. Although there are several sources of big data, the most important for many purposes is the expression of people online, especially social media. These advances are instances of machine learning, a term that in my view is synonymous with most applications of AI and is the technical advance that accounts for current imagination and effects of AI. So about imitation and prediction. AI machine learning systems imitate by being able to discern and reproduce patterns in big data, and predict by being able to produce a plausible output from a variety of inputs. These are somewhat abstract definitions. They're better captured by simple examples. To imitate, an example is how Google Translate works. I input the ragged ragamuffin ran around the red rock. And it comes out in French, which I will not attempt to pronounce because Freddie's here and she will laugh. So predict, what is this a picture of? Okay, so I'm sure that most of you will get the first two without much trouble, but it's a challenge for both people and machines to distinguish what the picture of the third is, whether is that a cat or is that a dog? So I'm going to talk in three parts, as the title suggests. The first is imagining AI in business. With these preliminaries, we can get on with talking about imagining AI in business. So in business, prediction is a big thing. And modern computation is entwined with expectations of computational prediction. During the 60s and 70s, major investments were made in macroeconomic models requiring computer solution. In 1972, the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth popularized predictive systems analysis. And we could debate the accuracy of these models, but my point today is that they have shaped imagination and hence expectations. The cartoon, you press the button, the data goes round and round, and whoa, and it comes out here. The kind of expectation that the computer is able to make effective predictions. There's something beyond that, though, which is our willingness to cede authority to predictive models, particularly those that require human-computer solution, can be troubling, can be problematic. We'll come back to that theme as well. We appear to want these models to be authoritative, and this is further evidence of their influence on our imagination. So once upon a time, newspapers and other print media attracted an audience by offering content, news, articles, opinion, editorial, cartoons, and actually also advertising. Their business model was to sell advertising based on the nature of the readership, which they studied with some care. At the beginning of this century, new competitors for this advertising revenue appeared: Google, Amazon, Facebook, and so forth. These companies, commonly referred to as the platform companies, message or selling point to advertisers was that they could deliver advertisements customized to the interests of the viewer. How could they do this? By observing the behavior of users, they could create machine learning models, AI, that would predict interest and response. The dominant share of revenue of all of the platforms, except for Amazon, are based upon this selling point to advertisers, and the success of these companies has removed much of the oxygen revenue from newspapers and much of other print and broadcast media. So where did all this observation of user behavior come from? Well, in my view, the invention of a better rat trap. So here we have two rats looking at a rat trap and saying, look, cheese. And the human version, look, an internet connection. We feed big data. The applications of machine learning to advertising are, of course, only the beginning because of the amount of data that is being accumulated. These people are all pursuing various purposes, mostly getting from point A to point B, but in the process, they are creating the raw material for further AI application. But not only, our world is increasingly filled with surveillance devices that capture data. I know this very well living in London, where I am appearing on some CCTV system many times a day if I have the temerity to move across the city. Now let me digress a little bit about this data and ask the question, what is personal data? There's a lot of talk about personal data. We may talk about it more today in relation to various affordances that are offered by ICTs. Often these discussions are coupled with the idea of our personal data being a valuable resource and ideas about granting some form of property right to this data. So for me, some of you will know that I view this as a problematic argument. It contends that we have a property right on what others may observe about us. In this first instance, in the first instance, it should be, we should have some rights concerning private behavior in our homes. We regard it as problematic if others can observe us in our homes. It is, however, well established that we do not have the same rights of privacy in the workplace. See below, which is a common disclaimer in an employment contract. And similarly, when we enter a public place, the capacity to observe our behavior cannot be controlled. So the question is how we should view our online behavior, like the home, the workplace, or a public space. My answer to this is that it amounts to two forms of data. One, the type of information that is collected when you press that button, the submit button. The other is the data gathered by observing our behavior in online spaces, and I think this is akin to workplace or public space. So from a purely economic viewpoint, we would ask, what is the marginal value of observing you? That is, you specifically. And my answer is very nearly zero for predictive AI. If we exclude you from the picture, the value of the predictive model is not substantially impaired. So the value of your data of the second type is very low. However, the value of our collective contribution is actually rather large. So this leads, in my view, to a discussion of how the collective, not the individual, should be compensated for the value created by AI platforms, AI applications such as platforms. But I'll stop there. I said it was a digression. It's a topic for another lecture. So why settle for prediction? Use the presentation of information in the form of advertising, social media posts, search results, etc., to stimulate behavior. One can think of this as machine learning orchestrated behavioral experiment on internet users without ethical guidelines. With appropriate stimuli, individuals can be encouraged to take decisions, purchase, voting, beliefs that would otherwise languish in maybe tomorrow limbo or in some other limbo. They wouldn't be realized as actual imaginations. It's possible to overstate the efficacy of nudging. It's not like the hypnotic suggestion that you are now a rooster. However, it can have big effects if it is applied to large populations. An example of this here, Dilbert says, I combined a DNA test kit with big data to predict a person's future health issues. And that depressing knowledge caused every member of the test group to make risky lifestyle choices. Now half of them are dead. At the risk of bragging, that's exactly what my model suggested. Okay, third, the human use of human beings. Originally, this was a title of a book by Norbert Wiener, and this title evokes a third feature of AI machine learning in business: control. We can use existing as well as new, for example, Internet of Things technologies to monitor human behavior in the workplace. Then we can decide that we would like this behavior to be, what we would like this behavior to be from an efficiency or productivity viewpoint. So AI machine learning can not only manage the monitoring, it can also be used to orchestrate the experiments, either by nudge or dictation, and assess the results. In this model, humans become instrumental to our purposes. They become cogs in the wheel. They become replaceable parts in the machine. And this is exactly what Wiener feared would happen. Here's an example. So Dilbert is told from now on by his boss, from now on, salaries will be based on your predicted success, not your past performance. We ran a computer model against your education and DNA information, and we predict you'll die in a stapler mishap within a week. Dilbert replies, what if I disagree with this prediction? Okay. To which his boss replies, write up your opinion and staple it to the analysis. So when we ask about technological unemployment, is it the right question? We have had a wave of new predictions of technological unemployment, AI, robotics, and other intelligent systems replacing workers. I am more concerned about the use of AI to redefine work roles and performance. Of course, knowledge managers, the people who ask you how to do your job so that they can design a system to replace you, are a threat. Make no mistake about that. But more insidious is the system designer who decomposes work processes and strips out worker autonomy so that performance can be monitored and enforced. This is what makes the worker into a robot, in many cases making investment in the robot unnecessary. People are still cheap, relatively speaking. So to summarize my remarks about imagination of AI in business, the instrumental use of AI relies upon big data, which the big tech companies have devised ingenious ways for gathering. AI machine learning makes it possible to design prediction engines, nudge efforts, and new approaches to monitoring and control. All of these applications raise ethical issues and suggest the need for regulation. At present, none of these applications are subject to meaningful regulation, which means all of the benefits of AI are tempered or offset by problematic features in their application. The second part of my remarks is about imagining AI in the laboratory, or imagining AI in science. Some years ago, it was hard for me to believe when I looked it up here that it's 7 years ago now, I wrote an article with my supervisor and colleague, Nathan Rosenberg, about engineering knowledge. And in that article, we looked at the historical nature of engineering knowledge and concluded that it was largely based upon data and trial, and not very much based upon science, and not very much based upon predictive results from scientific experimentation. And at the conclusion of this article, we said, indeed, the extent to which large-scale databases that are accumulating as a result of improved instrumentation of the efforts to digitize information recorded in other forms or derived from artifacts in museums and archives, and of the worldwide search for new biological and physical information, provide vast new bodies of empirical information subject to search. Sometimes this search would be guided by pre-existing theory, and others simply by the discovery of pattern or order in data. And it seems to me that we are on the advent of the use of AI to transform practices in science and engineering towards being data-driven rather than science-driven, or data-driven before they become science-driven. What do I mean by that? Since the advent of modern computers, methods for modeling and simulating biological and physical systems have grown in complexity and scope. Although models and simulations may exceed an individual human capacity to anticipate their outputs, they are distinct from AI in two senses. One, they are ultimately deterministic models, even when they include stochastic or probabilistic elements, and their outputs are a direct consequence of their inputs. And second, for practical reasons, the scale of the inputs is linked to human cognitive limits, which exceeding these limits means losing track of whether the outputs have any relation to reality. Now, one might say it's true that machine learning models are also a direct consequence of their inputs. However, what is not the case with machine learning systems is that the way that inputs are translated into outputs can be easily traced, which is one of the main problems with standards that have been proposed, such as explainability for the operation of AI systems. It's very much like the earlier cartoon in which the guy pushes the button and the computer generates the answer without knowledge of how that's done. So if we think about the main applications of this machine learning technique in science, we could say that it certainly is in geophysical systems, weather, mineral, earthquakes, volcanism, ocean temperatures and currents, in astronomical systems, in biological systems, in clinical medicine, and in an area dear to our hearts, mapping and measuring scientific communication. And all of these areas offer opportunities for the application of artificial intelligence machine learning, and I'm going to focus on biological systems and clinical medicine because both offer opportunities to search for pattern or order without the benefit of predictive theory. By the way, the second picture here is our place in the universe. The red dot being our galaxy in a space of a very much larger and more distant in time map of the evolution of the universe. So during my lifetime, a major new interdisciplinary science emerged, bioinformatics. Major task of this new field is dealing with the exclusion of observations of genetic diversity. You're probably all aware of this in general terms, but what is the scale of this explosion? One of the databases in the field, GenBank, noted that their addition to their database in the 70 days, between two releases of their database, the database grew by 11 billion base pairs, nearly 11 billion base pairs. But actually, as a point of reference, the human genome contains 3 billion base pairs, and the celebrated Human Genome Project required 13 years to complete mapping of this 3 billion base pairs. So every 70 days, we are now, and it's shorter now, it's shorter every time, we are expanding by several times the amount of information that we found in the human genome during the Human Genome Project. Now, while the amount of information collected may seem large, we're still at a relatively early stage in gathering this information, let alone understanding its meaning. Variations between individuals are significant. 3 to 5% variance from reference sequence. I'm sure you've all heard of the that 3 to 5% variance is about the same variance as we are from chimpanzees. I leave you to conclude the significance of that observation. The human system has much more than human DNA. For example, the microbiome contains 1 to 3 times the number of cells in the human body and 10,000 separate organisms, each with their own DNA sequence. So to sort out a human being, it's not just sorting out their DNA. But if we're going to create artificial life, we could imagine eventually building customized human beings. But we're going to need to start somewhere, and that would be building much smaller and less complex organisms. And we could think of this as proceeding on 4 levels: biological synthesis of useful chemicals, altering useful organisms to produce different things or altering their productive properties, constructing artificial useful organisms, and constructing ecologies of artificial useful organisms. All of these have ethical issues. Nonetheless, it is likely that all of these levels will be explored with increasing intensity. In doing so, a further cascade of information will be generated for which only AI/ML techniques are likely to provide the tools needed to understand and better meet objectives that we set in the exploration. So one way to think about this is that during the 90s, we had combinatorial chemistry, which promised drug breakthroughs or pharmaceutical breakthroughs. A little bit overhyped, it turned out, but we're now likely to see the development of combinatorial life, involving large-scale generation of variants of existing viable organisms and their synthetic cousins. As with combinatorial chemistry, the appraisal of the results of these combinatorial life experiments will be a difficult process, and again, one in which artificial intelligence machine learning techniques are likely to be useful. As empirical knowledge grows, it will be possible to develop models that allow simulation of expected results, further accelerating the process of new organism design. So turning to the second area, AI and clinical medicine, we're fairly relaxed about experimenting on yeast. This is more or less yeast. When we talk about experimenting on yeast, we don't have too many concerns about ethical considerations so long as we have effective biocontainment, but we generally frown on experimenting on humans. In fact, our life choices and events combined with genetic variation create an enormous variety of outcomes in our health and well-being. And clinical medicine seeks to identify and treat illness based upon our evolving knowledge of the human biological system. So one might imagine that patient records could provide a fruitful big data resource. In fact, this is very often touted. You know, the NHS, wonderful resource for improving healthcare. Well, wish that it were so, that those records were compiled in a way that facilitated access. If the NHS patient records were actually a big data warehouse, it'd be lovely if it was, but actually they're much more ad hoc, even for hospital patients. Even if you're admitted into the hospital and much more copious data is gathered about you, it doesn't work its way into a usable form. And as a result, there's much less data than we might imagine is usable. In fact, making patient data usable for machine learning is actually a big task. Nonetheless, enough data does exist to apply some machine learning techniques. It falls rather short of what can be imagined. So why aren't these imaginations coming into reality? It's not because of safety or privacy concerns, although these are often cited. It is because the investments being made are those that will generate near-term profit. Herbicide-resistant crops, patient monitoring for new pharmaceuticals, most everything else is small by comparison. Those of you that have learned the SPRU catechism understand the terms market failure and systems failure. I submit that there is a further sort of failure that we should be paying more attention to, imagination failure. Imagination about what possibilities exist that are not being developed because the near-term profitability of doing so is insufficient. That concludes part 2 of my talks, and now I turn to the fun part, imagining AI in fiction. So, artificial intelligence in fiction usually means science fiction. This is a part of literature that has as many detractors as fans. When AI appears in science fiction, it usually is being carried around by an android or robot, hence our cover montage. Remind you of that. There are exceptions, of course. Colossus, some of you may know, HAL of the Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick collaboration, Skynet, which underlies the Terminator series, and most recently the AI personal assistant Samantha in the movie, I've forgotten the name of the movie. Someone help me there? Her. There we go. Are examples of disembodied AI representations in film and literature. For our purposes today, we might be useful to consider the treatment of imagining AI in literature under 3, not 2 headings. I added one. First, imagining AI origins. So one of the favored origins of AI in science fiction is intelligent design, not by supernatural power, but by human beings. One or more humans set out to create an AI and they succeed. In older works, this was often to gain a military advantage, for example, Colossus and Skynet. But more recently, the imaging of the creator is imprinted on the AI through uploading. And uploading refers to the transfer of human consciousness to a human system. A truly horrifying movie in which Johnny Depp is rendered as a transcendent being in the movie Transcendence. Then we have spontaneous emergence. For me, this is the spookiest of the origin story. One day, the global information infrastructure wakes up. No explanation of how, but one day it does. Third, evolutionary emergence, incrementally making individual systems more intelligent and stimulating competition between them for survival creates a Darwinist evolutionary project leading to AI. I'll come back to that in a moment. And finally, idiosyncratic origins. There are quite a few of these, and most of them involve external agency. For example, answers to the Fermi paradox. Everyone know what the Fermi paradox is? Right. So if there are lots of intelligent people in the universe, where are they? That's the Fermi paradox. Since we, and actually they're there waiting to give us their artificial intelligence solutions. Since we still have very little understanding of what is responsible for consciousness, all of these origin stories seem to have some plausibility to them, and hence the industry of creating AI science fiction continues. When we come to the issue of the operation of AI in science fiction, it's actually rather vague. Many times, science fiction authors are implicitly using the singularity idea, in which exponential increase in capabilities and complexity spontaneously produces intelligence. Sometimes the evolutionary approach is invoked, including the recursive self-improvement idea. You design a machine that is capable of designing a better machine, and the better machine designs a better machine, and so forth. This is one of the ideas behind runaway artificial intelligence. And the author Rudy Rucker, who's a mathematician, computer scientist, and a science fiction writer, is a pioneer in this area. So more recently, the idea that ICT networks have similarities to the network structure of the brain suggests AI emergence in a network context, and back to the network wakes up idea. So a footnote to these kinds of ideas is Werner Vinge's idea of a collective intelligence that he expresses in the book of Fire Upon the Deep. In that book, humans interact with an alien species similar to our wolves, and these aliens are intelligent because they communicate across a broad acoustic spectrum, that is a high bandwidth, which allows them collectively to be sentient, even though an individual is not. So if you meditate upon that a while, you come to various insights about how intelligence might be. And there are a number of things in the computer science literature concerning large-scale brains in which neurons are separated. And the question is, what bandwidth is necessary in order to connect them together to have them effectively function as a brain would, as our brains would. So when we think about AI motives, science fiction is predominantly dystopian, anti-utopian. One has to search assiduously for utopian science fiction. Hence, the motives of woken AI tend to be malevolent or at best indifferent. Malevolence usually takes the form of exterminate the humans, and this is often cast in Darwinian terms, that artificial intelligence replacing human beings because it's, after all, superior. A part of the plot, for example, of the Forbin project, when Colossus seizes control of the world's nuclear arsenals and threatens to discharge it unless its commands are obeyed, results in this scene at the right, where numerous political leaders are summarily executed under the watchful eye of the computer. Well, you don't have to be malevolent. You can simply be indifferent. So in 2001, Hal's sacrifice of crew member Frank Poole is in the service of the mission. But most often, AI simply departs the human realm in some fashion. So an intermediary case is the superintelligent AI. And this is the idea of recursive improvement, which I won't elaborate again. These are the scary scenarios that those concerned about the existential threats of AI are concerned about. As I've tried to make clear, it makes interesting science fiction, but we actually need something more in terms of mechanism to imagine this sort of AI coming about. Certainly not directly from machine learning as currently being practiced. However, if we stay on this theme of imagining motives, there is the question of coexistence. Could we coexist with AIs? And some of you may have seen the recent UK television series Humans, which addresses the existence of coexistence, addresses coexistence, and comes to rather negative conclusions. Of course, it's not the AI that fails, it's the humans that fail in this series. At the opposite end of the spectrum, well, we could say data is an example of successful coexistence. And for those of you that read really old science fiction, Asimov's Foundation series, which was, by the way, a favorite of Osama bin Laden, who named Al-Qaeda after that series of books. Not bin Laden, but rather Asimov, imagined a character named Daniel Oliva. And Oliva is a super intelligent AI who conceals his identity in order to guide humans to a better outcome. On the other hand, Data rather poignantly wants to be more human. And this wanting to be human was particularly well exemplified in Spielberg's movie AI with its character David, whose quest for becoming human is truly epic and mirrors that of Pinocchio. And for a variant of this, you may look at Charles Stross's Saturn's Children series, which imagines robots without humans, but some of them were designed to be for humans. And so what do they do after humans are no more? So all in all, though, the possibility of coexistence suggests that there might be an upside to AI, even in this extreme vision after all. So to summarize AI and fiction, the most remarkable thing about AI and fiction is it is generally imagined as human-like in its motivations and self-understanding. Of course, this is possible. But it just seems just as likely to me that superintelligent AI that might emerge or evolve will be more like the extraterrestrial, that is, beyond human understanding, or seeking to transform human beings to something else. Such an AI may not be good news for human beings, at least those who might wish to continue to evolve at our own very slow pace. So to conclude it all, the idea of AI, I think, is a stimulant for human imagination. Unfortunately, human imagination is often stored in the attic and only retrieved when we encounter problems in our everyday lives. So the incremental nature of innovation means that we first employ new technologies to do the things we're accustomed to doing. It takes longer to imagine entirely new ways of doing things, and this is the case in business, in science, and in literature. I believe that we are only at the beginning of the changes possible with the use of machine learning AI for both good and ill. And instead of an upcoming AI winter, I see an AI spring. In short, not in short, in short, you ain't seen nothing yet. I made this same comment 20 years ago in Toronto, speaking on the future of ICT. It is still appropriate for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to have the applauses. Hashtag you haven't seen nothing yet, so we can, if you want to share on social media. So thanks a lot, Ed, for the stimulating talk, which indeed fit exactly what we wanted. So to give a sort of broad platform to inspire thinking, reflection, not only research, but also to inform the way in which we think and imagine AI. So you can see from the comments that there has been quite some appreciation. Now, before taking a short break, there is some time for Q&A. And I don't know, Ed, if you want to go through the comments, or would you like me to read the questions that you received?
Well, there are 33 of them here, so my processing power is limited. You may have had a better look.
Okay, so we start the very question. So the first one is one from Maria Savona. Well, I mean, if people also want to unmute them and repeat them would be nice, so we can hear some people talking. There was a Maria that I think has a couple of questions, but there was a first comment about dumbness.
Yeah.
So Maria, if you want to say it.
No, it was more of a joke rather than than a question, but
it's also inspiring.
I was intrigued at, well, by the way, thank you so much. I was intrigued by your concept of imagination. So I was just wondering whether this, the way you close in the end, so you haven't seen anything yet, is just because there is a sort of sort of endogenous mechanism for which AI development is going to be slow, like human imagination. So is this your main take? And my question was related to the fact that because dampness is distributed to a certain extent in the world, then the development of AI, or the imagination on AI and the expectations on AI is necessarily constrained by how failures of imagination is distributed in the world.
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty evenly distributed, and the difference, the significance of the difference is that the various systems of the world, both socio and political, have different capacities for bringing forth intelligence. And although I'm sort of a person who has some natural socialist tendencies, my observation of socialism in practice is that it's not entirely effective at bringing forth human capacity. Which has some benefits because that human capacity includes the capacity, imagination to do ill as well as good. So maybe we should constrain the exercise of human imagination to some degree. But nevertheless, for the new imagination initiative to take hold, requires a social and political system that's able to effectively recognize and bring forward imagination, because otherwise we just go on doing the same old thing the same old way. And this is particularly poignant in the context of transitions and transformations, something that I'm spending a lot of time with now. We need imaginations that really transform our existing practices.
So probably we have a responsibility in academia too. And sorry, I'll stop here.
Yep.
There is thank you. There is a question from Jonathan Subset.
Jonathan, long time no see.
Hello, Ed. Good to see you. Looking and sounding well.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I liked your suggestion of the imagination failure and adding this to the list of failures to think about. And I'm wondering to what extent AI itself can help to remedy this condition. So I've got a PhD student who's working with search engines and trying to reconfigure these to be more random and to help guide idea generation processes and creativity. And he's testing this out in advertising agencies and trying to help the creatives in broadening out the scope of their ideas more than they would get from a standard Google search.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
When I was quite young, I was a person who delivered newspapers. In the US at that time, I called them newspaper boys. So I was a newspaper boy, and I delivered papers to graduate student housing, married graduate student housing. And so when I collected the money for their subscriptions, they would sometimes engage me in conversations, usually quite patronizing ones. And one of them asked me one time what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I told them, I want to be a psychometrician. Okay. Which rather set them back. They weren't expecting a 12-year-old to say, I want to be a psychometrician when I grow up. But indeed, the whole question of measuring individual personality proclivities and capabilities, susceptibilities to stimulus of this that can be then, as I'm suggesting, generated by artificial intelligence is a big new opportunity area, it seems to me.
Thank you. Then there were a series of comments kick-started by Ekaterina on the emerging patterns or emerging intelligence, which are more comments, and Josie and then Anne as well. But there was also a question from Farva Sial, if you want to tell it directly. If not, I will read it. I wonder if the AI imagination nexus is jumping the gun. As Maria noted, in relation to stupidity, AI is not without context. Missing aspect of the context, such as that which leads to racial discrimination, is also a product of the greater context. For example, knowledge production, values in which AI is systemized. It is also a comment, but it was a more big consideration.
Well, yeah, that's what I was trying to get across in my message about application to employment. For example, I don't know, was that in this talk? I did 3 talks this week, so I'm getting a little confused. So we have new systems to filter AI, to filter employment applications using AI systems. And it seems, since we train these based upon human decisions, it seems the main implication of the systems is that they make the same mistakes as the humans make, just faster. Okay, this is an improvement, but it's also a failure of imagination to understand that actually the way we make employment decisions is pretty flawed already. Maybe we should be thinking about improving the design of such systems rather than simply substituting AI for human decision-making. An example of ceding the decision-making to the machine when in fact the underlying model of making the decisions is not very good.
Thank you. There is a question from Conrad. It was about, I think he's there. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just, I can't remember what I wrote now, but it was about governance and the global governance. This is a global problem or issue. So how do you see that progressing? And is it possible?
Well, we'll see after the American election. The fate of global governance these days is not particularly positive. However, societies throughout the world face similar problems. And the question that we would ask is the standard question of to what extent is it necessary to have a global governance as opposed to localized governance? I think one of the speakers, perhaps Katya, is going to talk more in detail about democratizing AI, something that I'm keenly interested in. But we can think about high-level regulation governance. We can also talk about alternative modes for delivering artificial intelligence other than centralized data collection and the control of those by very big actors such as the platform companies.
There is a, thank you. There is a question because we are getting, we still have 10 minutes, but there is a question from Juan, but maybe given that Juan is going to talk later, he can mention that. I don't know if he's fine with that. So we'll go for the people that have no chance to talk in the next sessions. There is a question from Ekaterina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ed, for the wonderful talk. It was my question was rather related to how far beyond the imitative AI we need to really go and discuss, because in the end, that was my bit philosophical question, that capabilities of AI being excelling in many fields above humans, that's very measurable fields. But if AI do the capabilities of AI expand beyond once the consciousness of a science fiction style AI would come to the being? in a sense that if AI would acquire consciousness, do we gain really something with having that AI, or it would be still indistinguishable from mere imitation? And if so, would we be able even to understand that? Of course, there is this issue that you talked about, Turing tests. It's just interesting if we do not completely understand the consciousness in terms of biology, psychology, in all the sciences that study consciousness, would we be even able to distinguish whether AI became better human than humans? Thank you.
Right. So we tend to think in terms of AI as something that can answer questions. In fact, that's how Turing framed his test. And I would, in fact, that's why I put the little cartoon there, which is, I think a somewhat deeper test is the capability to ask the questions. Okay. So if we think of AI as answering questions, what is asking the question? And therein your point about human understanding, I would say that a good measure of transcendent intelligence is a capability to answer questions that other people cannot comprehend. Okay, so if we can ask a question, not that people can comprehend because it is not clearly stated, but merely because it's such a different way of thinking about the world than they can manage within their cognitive limits, then we have achieved a kind of transcendent intelligence, at least from the local context. So if we go back to the Middle Ages and ask somebody a question about heredity, they may well have views about heredity. In fact, they're successfully improving animals and plants by using implicit knowledge about heredity. But if we ask them a question about stimulating mutations in order to achieve a better effect in their selection process, this will seem very, very strange to them. Okay, it will be a question completely outside of their cognitive limits because they don't have the underlying understanding of encoding of heritable characteristics that we have currently. So when you start asking different questions underlying a different understanding, and I've given a very simple example, but you can go very quickly to a place where human beings would not be able to understand the questions that are being asked, and therefore that would, for me, signal the beginning of a sort of transcendent AI. We're very far from doing that through machine learning technique, as I tried to suggest.
We have quite many questions and a few minutes, so I would ask both the question and the answers to be more quick in order to pack more things if we can. Yeah. There is Ben Loxton.
Hi there. I was just wondering about your comment about documenting workflows and that potentially undermining job security. There's quite a few examples within the big platforms at the moment where sort of processes have been automated and those roles have then shifted to more imaginative kind of product roles, and it's just meant that things have shifted from kind of automatic functions into imagination, which would seem like a good use of AI in order to promote imagination within the workplace. There's a book called Day One that was written quite recently about that. So I just wondered if kind of that was within your sort of scope when you mentioned that sort of documenting one's own workflow might actually lead to your own sort of demise within the organization.
Well, it might. Indeed, the question is how many Imagineers do you need in the organization? And are all the people equally skilled at that particular role? We could say, yes, this is a wonderful and uplifting role for those people that are able to do it. And it has been argued for a long time that there would be the prospect to improve the quality of work by making it more systematic. In fact, this goes back to scientific management. However, it's better for some, those people that are actually able to swim in those waters, than for others. And then you have to answer the question, Ben, whether you think that that's a good thing with regard to everyone, or whether you think the gains from that exceed the losses of those that get left behind and left out of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where obviously the ethical concerns come in that don't seem to factor too much in the at least the tech companies' consideration of many of these things. Just one other point as well, just very high level. I just highly recommend The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster if you haven't read it already. It's the most prescient sort of sci-fi thing I've read about 100 years ago about the internet, essentially.
I agree.
Thank you. Now, Michael or Michelle, because there is an accent in the name, O'Connell.
Mihal,
even I missed it completely. Okay, please.
Margaret Bowden, who's based at Sussex, raised a lot of alarm bells about this a few years ago. The idea that artificial intelligence could simulate affect, or that robots would be able to simulate emotions, and that was a really dangerous kind of concept. But someone in the audience responded to her saying, well, isn't that what human beings do anyway? A lot of the time, there's a dangerous kind of characteristic in people in that they manipulate emotional effects too. And I just wondered out loud, really, that this kind of connects quite directly with customer service roles where people are expected to pretend, in a sense, to be friendly. Isn't that precisely a kind of robotic behavior?
Oh, indeed it is. And this is under the general rubric of deceptive AI. So AI is certainly well poised to be deceptive in terms of mimicking emotional, affective behavior. If you think about the problem of controlling this or regulating this, you've put your finger exactly on the problem, which is that we're hardly able to regulate human behavior that's deceptive. Why should we be any better at regulating deceptive artificial intelligence behavior? So I think this is one of those ills. This is a world where you don't get stupid robot calls. You get intelligent robot calls. You don't get stupid emails that ask you to send your banking details. You get really intelligent ones that speak to you personally, that ask you to share your bank details. Yeah, that's the world we're moving into. I don't think there's a great deal of control that can be done. I think we simply have to get better at understanding the nature of deception and being able to cope with it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now I have to do a painful act as a chair, which means to call for a little break because we have to stick to the agenda. So I don't think we can respond to other questions, but Ed, I don't know if you are available for people to contact you in some way, or anyway, the questions are on the chat. So if there is less debate in case later on for the panel, we can continue to discuss these issues, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I'll have a look at the chat and maybe send people some messages. What I'll do is I'll address specific people in my response, but I'll make a response to everyone so that others can share what I respond, if that suits.
That is fantastic. Instead of a personalized advertisement, you will get personalized Ed Steinmueller. So I think this was already a very great part A of the event. Now, as agreed, we have a 5 minutes break that technically is 3, but let's say we can bring it to 5, and then we reconvene for the workshop / panel discussion.
So I hope many of you are back or have stayed for the fantastic lecture we had by Ed Steinmueller. So now we move to the second part of the workshop, which is looking at are we heading towards a new AI winter? So before we move on to that second part, a few housekeeping things. So again, this session is still being recorded. So if you are here and you want to join, obviously you have to know that you're being recorded. So you can turn your camera on. At this point, we will keep people muted for the first part as well. And if you have any questions on intervention or anything else, put them in the chat box. We'll be collecting them, and in the Q&A part, we'll be accepting intervention. So again, welcome back to this workshop on AI. Are we heading towards a new AI winter? And it's organized by the AI group, so the mobilizer group of the University of Sussex Business School, and which academics from the business school and from SPRU are participating, exchanging on ideas and working on AI. And so we got a fantastic lineup of panelists, as Simone was saying, rising stars working on AI. I would associate them as young, not middle-aged, as they were saying earlier. And at the end of the session, we also have a wrap-up given by Tommaso Ciarli on behalf of Simone Vannuccini, Maria Savona, and myself. We did a bit of work thinking about what is the current state of economics of innovation work on AI, and where could future work be heading. So I'm going to give you a few introduction about all of our speakers in the order of them speaking. So we have today Juan Matheus Garcia, who is the head of innovation mapping at Nesta, and he's working a lot on the AI as a field of research, and his latest paper is on narrowing of the AI research field, which is very interesting, highly recommended. Then we're going to have an intervention by Dr. Beatrice Fazi, who is lecturer in the digital humanities in the School of Media, Arts and Humanities, and she has a strong interest in the abstract character of computational system. And we'll be having a final presentation by Katia Bego, who is a principal researcher at Nesta and a data scientist there at the Technology Future and Exploration team. And she's been working a lot on the future of internet and democratizing the internet. So they each have 10 minutes presentation, then we follow by a Q&A discussion, and then we finish by an intervention of Tommaso. So Juan, are you ready? Can you share your screen?
Yeah. Let's see if this works. So I'm assuming that people can see this.
Thanks.
Yeah?
And I think you shared also the slides already in the chat for
I've,
everyone, right?
I know that I'm not going to have time to go through everything. Actually, I better start counting my time. So everyone now has a PDF. Okay, well, so thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this great event, and also thanks to Ed for a fantastic presentation before, lots of questions and things to discuss. I guess here I'm going to start by focusing a bit on the question for the session, which is, are we moving towards a new AI winter? And I guess I'm going to try to come up with a more, I guess almost like a definition of what we mean by an AI winter. I'm going to be arguing that we are not coming to an AI winter, but we should nevertheless be worried about where we are going. I'm going to be saying that for that reason, we might want to hedge our bets and not focus on a single AI trajectory, but try to preserve diversity on the trajectories which are explored. I'm going to be quickly taking us through some results from a paper we have written talking about that. And then I'll conclude with policy implications. And the policy implications are going to be super high level, because I feel that Katia is going to get much more detail in that side of the question in her session. So, okay, so let's define AI winter. What is an AI winter? An AI winter is a sudden drop in funding for AI research driven by disappointment with AI progress. In other words, expectations of progress, what we may imagine that AI could do, isn't corresponded by real progress. I've represented this with a graph here, and you could imagine, for example, in the 1950s, people saying that we're going to get this computer that's going to read, it's going to grow wiser, it's going to be basically running the US Navy and doing all sorts of amazing things. Obviously, lots of excitement around this, expectations that over time, this AI system is going to become super powerful, funding increases, then we get to here, and there's a bit of a distance between what we have managed to build, these very clunky robots that are only able to follow very basic instructions and what we expected. So a person like James Lighthill comes in and says, actually, maybe we shouldn't be funding this because it's not delivering, and you get this sudden drop on AI funding. And I guess you could say that this is what happened with AI in the 50s and 60s. I guess today's machine learning and deep learning driven trajectory is slightly different. It has more funding, and including corporate sector as well as public funding. It's got less talk and maybe more robotic walk. So if you look at what scientists are saying about the potential of AI, they're being a bit more circumspect about building thinking machines or machines that are going to be able to replace people. The timeframes being considered are much wider. Even for technologies like driving a truck, where I guess there's been quite a few advances, also a few disappointments. And also we're getting, I guess, set of like, results which are closer to what we expected. You know, we actually, I mean, this is linked to videos of robots doing parkour and dancing and jumping and doing all sorts of like things that were imaginable even like a couple of decades ago. And also obviously like things like DeepMind's AlphaGo system beating Go champions. So we have a bit more of real progress in AI. I guess the question is, if this is what we are now, what's going to come in the future? And I guess there's growing concerns about AI, hidden costs, risks, decreasing returns. Are our perceptions of AI progress justified? So obviously there's a question of, is the funding going to the right activities? You know, there's a lot of funding going to targeted advertising, as mentioned before. There's a sense that maybe actually we have a bit of a trajectory getting into diminishing returns with like the current systems based on deep learning becoming, I guess, less performing as the amount of computation increases, maybe more people trying to game them as well in a way that has a detrimental impact on their performance. And obviously there's the fact that maybe we have lots of underestimation of costs. So actually it's almost like our perception of cost or measures of benefits are a perception, and actually there's some costs that mean that the reality is much worse. And obviously a really great example, obviously a very worrying example of this is, for example, around bias in AI systems, which means that actually some groups in the population and minorities and vulnerable groups might actually be getting a much worse deal for AI than other groups. So, and obviously this AI could be having a very negative impact on equality. So again, you know, there might be some reason for concern here. And I guess the question is whether we are in the right AI trajectory. I guess if there's uncertainty about the future, and we are pursuing this trajectory, which in some ways has shown potential, but in many other ways it's creating problems, we might want to hedge our bets about the future by preserving diversity in the technologies that we explore. However, today's dominant private sector players may have incentives to focus on today's promising and commercializable technologies. And I think this is very much in line with Ed's comment before about the limitations of how, or how AI, imagination of how AI could be applied in science is being greatly limited by where the commercial potential is. And we have explored this situation empirically in a recent paper. It's called The Narrowing of the AI Research Field. Here's a link to arXiv where we have the preprint. And I'm not going to get into like the methodology, just to say that what we do in this paper very quickly is we take the abstracts of a corpus of AI research, and we can get into a conversation about how we define that later. We basically analyze the composition and distance between the topics within that corpus in order to generate measures of thematic diversity in AI research. And we study it over time and also compare the diversity of research being undertaken by academic institutions and the private sector. I'm just going to give you the top line. Basically, it's going to have lots of charts, but I'm not going to get into the charts. I'm just going to give you the summary, and then you can look at the charts. Our analysis suggests that there's been a recent stagnation in the thematic diversity of AI research as deep learning becomes dominant and private sector companies become much more active in the field. Private sector companies, and especially technology firms, are much less thematically diverse than academic institutions in all of our metrics of diversity and all of the parameters we use to measure diversity. Private sector companies tend to over-specialize on deep learning, computation-intensive techniques, and internet products and services, especially ad targeting, recommendation systems, and things like that, and they're specialized in topics related to symbolic methods and statistical methods, health, and ethics. So maybe a lesser focus on application domains outside of like traditional kind of tech products and services. We see evidence of a convergence in the thematic profile of tech companies and elite academic institutions that they collaborate with hire from. So actually, when you look at some of the like top academic institutions in the US, actually they are quite low diversity, and this might to some extent link to the fact that they are collaborating a lot with industry and maybe in some ways being co-opted by industry. So that's another source of concern. Okay, so I guess, and these are some of the charts presenting the results. I'm actually not going to try to get into a lot of detail about this because we would run out of time. This is simply looking at the evolution of different measures of diversity based on different definitions of diversity and ways to parameterize diversity. This is evolution of different topics. And for example, you can see how symbolic topics to do with AI really decrease in time in terms of their importance, while other topics to do with deep learning, computer vision, natural language processing, and things like that grow a lot. Here we are looking at the level of participation of different types of institutions in research, and we see the increasing importance of companies in AI research, much different from when you look at research not involving AI. This is simply comparing AI diversity in non-company institutions with diversity in the companies, and according to all of our diversity measures and parameters, much less diversity in the private sector. This is looking at individual institutions, and especially the tech companies are the ones that have lower levels of thematic diversity after we control for their volume of activity. And this is simply looking at comparing the level of activity in different topics by the private sector and the public sector and public sector institutions. And obviously a lot of detail there that you can explore later if you're interested, and obviously read the paper if you want the full gruesome details of how we came up with these things. So just to conclude, I guess welcome to the Mechanocene, maybe. Like I was thinking in terms of like climate change rather than the arrival of the winter. I don't think we are moving towards an AI winter, as I said before, but what about a wildfire season? A situation where we are going to be having freak events and accidents. Think about flash crashes. Think about failure of AI systems at scale, like maybe what some people say we had in the last US election. Accidents, obviously, like physical accidents, as we have been already having with self-driving cars. All of this kind of stuff happening. Unequal exposure to risks. Those people who can pay to avoid risks are able to do that, while many others who are vulnerable are exposed. And lots of mitigation and adaptation. Let's create more data. Let's maybe build cities which are better adapted to self-driving cars. And maybe let's start to get used to all of this algorithmic error and make it part of our lives. somewhat like part of our new environment. So that's like one potential future. I guess the question is, what can policymakers do to manage this turbulence and minimize the time we spend inside it? I guess obviously improve our ability to measure AI progress and its benefits and costs. I guess operationalize the chart I showed you before. Preserve diversity of trajectories that are explored to avoid premature lock-in to today's dominant trajectory. And where we identify trajectories which are consistent with ethical values and that generate widely shared benefits, really proactively support those rather than let the market decide or even let scientists decide. And all of this, I guess, to avoid a situation where we wish the AI winter actually had arrived a bit sooner. And that's it. That's my email and contact details if anyone has any questions to follow up on and so forth. Thank you.
Great, Juan. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. So no AI winter in your perspective, but maybe we need more ethical or sustainable AI and thinking about that. Yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to move on to Beatrice for her intervention.
Thank you, Frederic, and thank you, Simone, for this invitation to spend the afternoon with you, with the Sussex Business School, its many friends. Thank you, Ed, for the brilliant talk. What a really, truly inspiring way to open this new tradition, I imagine, in Sussex, the tradition of AI lectures. Katja, Johan, I'm glad also to spend and share this space with you, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow. So I have 10 minutes today for my intervention, and I aim to stick to this time frame as much as possible. And yesterday I was writing down my notes for this talk. I started from considering the prompt that we have been given. How are we heading towards a new AI winter? This is such a rich question, which opens up to other equally rich questions about change and transformation, about seasons of research and development that come and go, and waves of technological expectations that will rise high, but might crash down equally mightily. And I was thinking about all that. I kept working with and within this metaphor of an imminent winter, of a harsh period of time when events largely turn against a plan. So I started thinking and asking, if a new AI winter is at the door, are we prepared? Do we have food, clothes, and shelter while we organize for the spring that will follow? And I was getting a little carried away with the metaphor, perhaps. It occurred to me that if winter is coming, what I should be really talking about today is alliances. So my 10 minutes today are precisely about that, allies and alliances. I will still be fulfilling the brief. I will consider the future of AI research, but I will take that future to be constructed by subjects, and I'm using here the term subjects in the broadest possible sense, subjects that might decide to work together or not. So I'll start from alliance number 1, the alliance of disciplines. My research is in philosophy, and as the humanities person in this virtual room, I might be expected to do what the humanities person in the room often does, arguing that humanities matter and should not be left behind. Today, I will not do that, not because I cannot or will not. Believe me, I can, and I did, but because I have little time to speak, and I will not waste it on assuming a defensive position. The alliance between disciplines that I'm arguing for is not, strictly speaking, about the humanities being invited to contribute to the push for economic growth. Although I want to stress that that invitation should be issued and that contribution should be forwarded. In the context of today's discussion, my argument for an alliance between disciplines is rather an argument about the conditions of possibility of the future, which need to be co-constructed with a shared sense of purpose that transcends specialization but does not neglect it. So I will use my own field of research as a brief example. Most people would agree that philosophy and science have much in common. For instance, their attention on speculation or blue sky thinking. Things get more complicated when philosophy is asked to look into technology, for technology is often understood, wrongly in my opinion, only in terms of instrumentality, and philosophy does not like much to think in terms of means and ends. Artificial intelligence, as a topic of wider social cultural concern, is offering the opportunity to reconsider humanity's traditional suspicion towards technoscience. I have been working in this area for a long time, and I remember when thinking about thinking machines was still niche. While AI has always been a profoundly interdisciplinary field, when it comes to philosophical research, this topic has traditionally been addressed most directly in areas neighboring with cognitive science, such as philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, and logic. Things have now changed. AI is not something that happens only in the lab, but a computational activity underpinning much contemporary living. As such, it's increasingly becoming a research concern for a wider set of philosophical agendas, such as, for instance, those of political theory, aesthetics, hermeneutics, and so on. So obviously, this is good news. However, I want to argue that the alliance between disciplines must run deeper than a grant application on a panel and an interdisciplinary event. As much as I enjoy doing both things, and of course agree that these activities are fundamental for shaping and fostering collaboration. Looking at the future, while much of the public discourse about interdisciplinarity is phrased in terms of what the humanities can bring to the table of national and international efforts for the economy, in my view, one crucial issue when considering how to cope with this metaphorical winter to come is determining whether the humanities decide to engage at all, and if so, how. If the humanities and technoscience are to be allied, this alliance is to be built upon shared conceptual foundations. So bringing computation and AI in the humanities lecture hall, for instance, cannot be uniquely about teaching students so-called digital skills, but should involve allowing for the conceptual nodes of much humanities work. And I'm thinking here, for instance, about the relation between thought and reality, nature and culture, abstraction, experience, things that humanity care to think and write about. Well, we should allow for those conceptual nodes to be fortified and perhaps also realigned by the urgency of 1 or 1,000 techno-future that await us. Digital media theory here offers a good case studies for how these alliances of discipline might work. Until relatively recently, a large part of new media events and situations was still addressed through the tropes of communication studies. Today, however, words such as algorithm and indeed AI have much currency. Digital media theory is a field of study that is still in the making, and perhaps also because of this, it has managed to catalyze this historical conceptual rapport to computing into what is surely a complicated, yet in my opinion, equally rewarding relationship, where partners are allowed to maintain their identity without dismissing each other. I want now to move to the second alliance that I will touch upon with you today. Alliance number 2, the alliance of humans and machines. I'm not going sci-fi here. The robots most likely are now rising and machines most likely will not take over. And while there is no Joe Connor to negotiate human-machine relations for us, this relation must be rethought, insofar as many of the previous modes of structuring that rapport have shifted or sunk, both in theory and in practice. Here I want to tell you briefly how I'm thinking about all this. I often talk about this in terms of the autonomy of automation, an expression that I use while developing a theoretical approach that considers computational agents no longer in terms of extensions or enhancements of human cognitive faculties. To put this with another expression that I also often employed, computation is computation. That is to say, the computational procedures stand alongside the living organism, the physical object, and also the mathematical idea. But it's a distinct entity with its own specificity. So in my work, I often argue that we should conceive automated modes of thought in such a way as to supersede the hope the machines might replicate human cognitive faculties, and that we should thereby acknowledge a form of autonomy in automated thinking processes. This involves moving beyond the view that machines may merely simulate humans. In past work I did on the concept of contingency and computation, I moved beyond that simulative paradigm by looking for and finding a form of indeterminacy that is internal to computing. In my most recent research on explainable AI, moving beyond the simulative paradigm involves for me addressing that difficulty of any rendition, mediation, or even any communication between two modes of abstracting, that of humans and that of machines, for which there is no a common phenomenological or existential ground. I don't have time to explain this further here, but you can see how for me that untapping the potential of the alliance between the human and the technological should be addressed not so much under the motive of the cyborg, that is, of a techno-assemblage that can be anthropomorphized or humanized because it embeds the augmentation, replication, and extension of pre-existing cognitive faculties, and then still projects a human form. Rather, the proper motive for me is that of the alien. And I'm really glad that Ed had something similar in his speech before, because we can really see here lines of thoughts aligning. So the appropriate motive for me is that of the alien, because there is a profound alterity. It is irreconcilable with any attempt to give it a human shape or a human destiny. Time is a tyrant, as we say in Italian, and my 10 minutes have already run out. So as I conclude, I should acknowledge that the alliances are often forged under the fire of a common enemy. Some of the challenges ahead for AI research are all too well identifiable. This long list includes public interest waning and funds drying up, what historically we saw as brought about past winter season in AI research. But these challenges also include the risk of repeating the mistakes of the past, politically, socially, scientifically, although today against the backdrop of failing geopolitical context and impending environmental disasters. I'm talking about alliances, though, without focusing on conflict, because just as I've not started my contribution on a defensive position, I will not end it on one either. Yes, alliances are often a reaction to a common enemy, but alliances are also formed among those who share a common aim or purpose. I mentioned this earlier, and I will conclude bringing in this point again. Purpose is the key word here. The technical language of innovation is not, strictly speaking, the language of my discipline or my field, but the concept of novelty is a central notion in the vocabulary that I employ to describe my philosophical project. So I conclude by addressing the shared purpose in terms of the production of the new, an epistemological as well as an ontological perspective. It is a challenge as much as it is an opportunity. The novelty at stake here is that of a new kind of thinking, the thinking of machines, but also a new kind of thinking about the thinking of those thinking machines. In more than one sense, then, the novelty at stake is also that of alternatives in governance, business, policy, that can fully engage and work with the novel and alien thought. And I'll stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beatricia. That was very interesting on the possibility of alliances between discipline, but also between the human and machine. That was, yeah, thank you very much. So now we move on to Katja. Will talk to us about, tell us more about what you're going to talk to us about. Thanks.
Hi, can you hear me well? Yeah, perfect. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Beatrice and Juan as well, and for SPRU for organizing and a great lecture before as well. I forgot to share my screen, sorry. Wait 1 second to do that. Yes. So this is a quick, you now just see the slides, right? Yes, okay. So hello everyone, my name is Katja B. I'm a principal researcher at Nesta, working with Juan as well. At Nesta, my work focuses on looking at the impact of emerging technologies. So how can solutions like AI help solve social problems? And how can we also conversely mitigate some of the impacts of new technologies on our societies, economies, etc. At Nesta, I mostly work on the Next Generation Internet project, which is an ambitious flagship program by the European Commission, which seeks to build a more democratic internet by 2030. So at Nesta, we lead a consortium of 7 partners from across Europe to help the Commission come up with a vision for this future internet and understand the building blocks. So there's both policy interventions and technological solutions that might help get us there. But of course, the use and also regulation of AI, a key part of that equation. And as part of this work on NGI Forward, we've recently released a visions working paper. So I just shared the link in the chat, which sets out a vision for a more democratic, resilient, sustainable, trustworthy, and inclusive future internet by 2030. It's a bit of a mouthful. And this paper takes a holistic look at many of the challenges we face on the internet today across all layers of the stack, with this interconnectedness a very important factor, we think. So you're really looking at from the infrastructure level up, all the way to how the internet and other sort of digital aligned technologies like AI are impacting even the physical world and our social interactions. And we try to understand in this paper which social dynamics, which core dynamics we need to address to help solve some of these underlying recurring issues that we see a lot in the digital economy, that sort of this self-perpetuating vicious circles. And of course, propose some concrete solutions to those as well. Next slide. So this image that you see in the slide shows a very, very simplified funnel visualizing an AI decision-making system and the sort of holistic nature of how those work. So this is really to reinforce that argument about needing to take a holistic view when we discuss AI as well. So that's specifically what we do with this project, because it's so broad in scope, is looking at dynamics across various rungs of the system. So you'll look at the specific AI, or what you would call AI machine learning, or whichever version of the slice of the system, but you'd also look at kind of the data that goes into it and how do you make that fair, or what's the environmental impact further down on the physical world of some of these systems. And what do all these dynamics mean for the future of AI, and specifically also for the emergence of AI that serves the public interest, which is very important to us. So within all of this, we're very interested in this discussion. I'm very interested in this discussion about the emergence of an AI winter. In this talk, I'll focus a little bit more about how some of the narratives or kind of wider trends in the internet space might be modeling some of the debates about AI, or kind of limiting the development of AI that serves the public interest, which that's very closely aligned, I guess, with this idea of an AI winter. But I won't maybe in the same way take a position of whether we are in an AI winter currently, but looking forward. So what I'll do is specifically talk about three trends that are very kind of dominant, or that we really see driving development on the internet today, and how they pertain to AI. So that's centralization of power over the internet and technologies like AI, a fragmentation of the global internet itself and heating up AI arms race, and how that also leads to sort of limits to the availability of public interest alternatives. And also simply the emergence of more things. We have more things than ever before connected. We're collecting more data. What does this all mean for the sustainability and resilience of future AI systems? So let me start with the first one. So this is a more centralization of power. So I'm not telling you anything new when I say that on today's internet, power is concentrated really in the hands of only very few actors who control what we read, what we see, and we are really living in a winner-takes-all digital economy, where there's usually just only space for a couple of actors to be dominant, and that tendency for those to ever get more and more powerful, and that group of dominant actors to get smaller and smaller. And we see that across rungs of the system. So we see that the largest actors get more powerful horizontally within layers of the system, but also vertically. So for example, big tech, we know them for being like dominant in the applications data space, but then they also increasingly own their own proprietary infrastructures. Or an example is that we all associate Amazon with being an e-commerce company, but they actually make most of their money with running like AWS, like with cloud infrastructure. And we see that not just with the sort of usual suspects, big tech, but across many countries, across many places. And this centralization, of course, also begets centralization. So the vicious cycle continues. So if you have most data, or you have most resources now, you're best able to train your algorithms, build better systems now, you're better able to afford to retain new talent, very scarce still, of course, in the AI space, and all of these kind of things. So it's not, so we kind of have to at some point break through that dynamic. And this is not just a problem of competition and leveling the playing field, but this is, I think, where maybe some of that AI winter discussion comes in. Also what Juan mentioned, because this really means that some of the most creative solutions never get made, that we limit experimentation, serendipity in the system, and we optimize for making a profit rather than sort of like looking at social good. So I'm thinking particularly here of a lot of resources being diverted for like solutions in the ad tech space, etc., that are maybe not the most diverse or interesting. So if you're curious about this image, it's not quite to do with AI, but I really like it. This is something that's done for an art project for NGI by a Belgian artist called Dries de Hoek. And he asked children in Senegal and Belgium to draw the internet, or what they thought the internet looked like. And as you can see, young children today really see the internet just as a series of walled gardens, rather than sort of more open and free internet of technology innovation space that previous generations still got to benefit from. It's quite sad in a way, right? Like the internet for them is YouTube, alphabet. But so the question is really, how do we let the pendulum swing back in the other direction in the innovation sphere? So one solution we explore in the paper, we explore quite many, is about opening up to, like access to data really through new data governance models. So there are a lot of things that are necessary to kind of bring that more diversity of actors in the sphere. But one of the key dynamic that we see is that sort of access to data just really allows you to keep perpetuating your position. So the current digital economy is really built on proprietary data lakes, and we propose breaking through this cycle through then looking at new data governance models like data trust and data commons, online identity, interoperability, where we as citizens can share our data on our own terms. And alternative smaller solutions can tap into this sort of decentralized data lake on fair terms. And with time, I do think that this could not lead to only some sort of fairer digital economy, but also a much more diverse AI research landscape, for example, opening up development to a different realm of explorations. It's a bit of a technical story and too long to get into now, so I've a bit grotesquely oversimplified it, but if you're interested, you can read in the paper of what this would look like on a technical level. Second trend is, I realize I'm running out of time, but is this idea of more fragmentation and geopolitical tension. So COVID-19 has accelerated the fragmentation and breakdown of governance systems. It was a long time in the making, to be honest. So tech has become one of the main theaters of geopolitical tension, and we see growing distrust about technologies like 5G, AI, strong push towards national sovereignty and decoupling, reducing the dependencies across the supply chain. And there's a real risk that we might end up with a fully functional splinter net if we continue on this path. And of course, that's not strictly AI, but those are very much interlinked to me. Within this context, we see heating up arms race also, of course, about becoming the leader in developing AI. And these tensions not only encourage the development of what we consider harmful applications, things like autonomous weapons, or kind of tools for hybrid warfare, like deepfakes, a bit more decentralized, but also risk a lot of like the sort of value-based precautionary principles, etc., particularly in Europe, have been quite dominant to be pushed to the side in favor of internet sovereignty. And you can see that a lot in the EU already, right? That there's now this really large sort of push for more investment that we see everywhere in order to become the leader, to build AI at all costs, abandoning values, etc. in the process. And I think also a second thing of this, which I think is quite interesting in terms of research diversity, is this hunting of the buzzword, basically. Also maybe creates a certain sense of mystique, ascribes a power to AI that maybe doesn't quite match the actual current capacities of the technologies. So I find quite funny, oh well, a bit disturbing, this quote from a couple of years ago from President Putin, saying that whoever would take the lead in shaping AI would be the next to rule the world. So you kind of start to ascribe something to AI that's maybe just still quite far off of where we actually are with what it can do. And I think it also disempowers policymakers in some way. So you could, how can you possibly govern and shape the trajectory of such a potentially powerful technology, right? So we see there's a lot in approaches to AI governance and ethics, which kind of remain unconcrete on the surface rather than create sort of very enforceable regulation and kind of even start to do some of the definitional work, calling everything AI, even things that aren't, etc. Trusting a lot on sort of black box companies to build these solutions for you because it is complicated. And we don't look enough at the fallibility and fragility of still many of these systems are kind of governed by. So to very specific examples, and not needs to happen to reinstill trust in sort of global technology systems. But we also said we need new models for global governance, cyber treaties, auditing of trust, and open standards and solutions. But we also need to, we can also do a lot more to empower policymakers to take charge here. So one thing we've recently done within NGI Forward, quite a small, quite specific example, but I quite like it, is that we funded, together with the city of Amsterdam and Helsinki, sort of world's first AI registry, which brings basically transparency to which algorithms are being used within the city for public service provision. And I think this registry on its own is very interesting, but it's mostly the mechanism through which they built this that I think could be a model for how we can bring trust to systems, empower policymakers to keep shaping the AI we want to see, while also at the same time creating an actual market alternative. So what we did here is that we looked a lot at procurement spending and set very strict rules for what we wanted this fair AI registry to be in procurement rules. So like annually several trillion is spent on public procurement spending. This is well known, it's 14% of EU GDP. So this is potentially quite a powerful mechanism that's really, even though it's quite obvious, is not really being used that much in the AI space yet. I mean, it's been quite a prominent example of how you could set conditions or you can make some of these things around fair AI much more enforceable if you proactively set the standards for it. So that was one example. Happy to talk more about it later. And then my last is a bit shorter point, and I'll be brief, is this thing about more things. So there is more than ever before, like I think this is something we really need to be thinking about when we have discussions about AI before we cement ourselves into AI infrastructures that are simply not sustainable in the long run and don't cripple already sort of unresilient systems. So there are more of us than ever before using the internet, using more devices, and using these devices in ever more energy intensive ways. So our personal data footprints continue to grow. IoT systems, of course, are contributing massively to the amount of data that we store. It's currently about 7% of global energy supplies is being used on fueling data centers, and also machine learning and like running particularly larger AI system takes like an inordinate amount of energy. So it's just something that as we're under the guise of smartness or innovation, like building or like locking ourselves into systems that are maybe simply not sustainable in the long run. So my last point is going to be that, yes, sure, we can have efficiency gains in building better AI systems, etc., but we do need a healthier relationship with data. And one thing we propose in our paper is around data minimization, which is a concept from the GDPR that's really about not indiscriminately hoovering up all data, even if it doesn't serve a concrete or direct purpose. But can we maybe like extend this principle of data minimization as we think about building AI systems to also be one about sustainability or making sure that we live within planetary and cognitive bounds? There's some simple ideas of information overload. And can we maybe extend this principle to think about what we want to keep and what we don't collect? So I'll keep it at this, as I've now gone over quite a bit, sorry. And looking forward to discussing some of these topics now more and how this all pertains to the idea of the AI winter.
Thank you so much, Katja. So we had a lot of discussion already going in the chat. So I might not take all the reflection in the chat, but take a few points, especially the questions. So maybe we could start. I'm going to gather a few questions as well, so a few of us can answer. So I'm going to take the question of Noor Ahmed, Ashish, Umra, and Maria, because she also had a point about data. So is Noor here and want to ask
yes.
his question?
Hi, thank you. So thank you to all three panelists. I mean, this is such an important conversation that we need to have. So especially with regards to Juan's like recent very important work on the narrowing of AI basically. So consistent with their work, I also find with my colleague that there is a like de-democratization going on in AI research. So particularly again, Juan tackled the problem for a very important and different angle though. Like I'm curious about what do you think of what are the mechanisms that led to that narrowing of AI? And in particular, do you think like the resources played any role whatsoever? And because I think that it has policy implications, which I think a lot of, this particular community is care about that kind of conversation. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask Ashish to follow on with his question.
Hi. So I made a comment more around the missing piece, around what Juan mentioned. So I personally am an academic for many years who's now working in industry. I work in an global innovation function as head of AI. And it's an interesting position to be in because I hear a lot of this discussion, and then I look at, well, as a corporate, a lot of the programs that are put are all strategically or hopefully strategically linked to some of the challenges and the problems that the business is trying to solve. And a lot of time that diversity, the loss of diversity, is because there's a lot more focus on how do you create near-term or short-term value and also try and balance that with building the future. And it's always kind of, whether you follow the 70-20-10 principle or 80-20, it's more about how do you balance the funding model of what's available and go towards what really drives value for the company and the customers and, and hopefully socially responsible technology as well. And wearing sort of multiple hats or sitting kind of with the academic hat on and then the industry hat on, I'm always challenged with this thing of, if I were to look at diversity, I would always choose how do you bring diverse or support diversity of research, which is where I try and look at funding university PhDs and research programs in conjunction with internal work, which is very much focused on, let's say, natural language processing to apply to document processing. Just problems that might not necessarily sound exciting to the outside academic community because they're not really grand challenges. But actually, these are real problems that industries are facing, right? We're not at the same level. We're still struggling with what seems like really small, uninteresting problems for really smart academics. But solving them might be a 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 million savings for the business. So why wouldn't you? And those are the kind of decisions that take place in the corporate world. So the diversity of what's chosen versus what's valuable versus those decisions around narrowing the scope is exactly where some of those decisions come to be. I also think that there's a massive area around startups and VCs where we're seeing an explosion of a lot of funding being provided for people who are smart and have good ideas and have found some white space where they can go and innovate. But culturally, big companies lack at this, the art of the possible kind of thinking, and they're just not enough, to Ed's point, Imagineers who are getting the support from the business because there's a lot of risk aversion within companies. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Let's have the final point by Maria, and then we let our panelists answer some of the intervention. Maria.
Yeah, thank you, Freddie. Thank you, Katja. That was all the panelists, actually, they're very inspiring, including Ed earlier, obviously. A little bit of premise on these data governance issues, and I've been lately obsessed with this issue, but in quite an amatorial way, I would say, and as an economist. So the premise to this question is that I've been discussing a lot with people in law, mainly, and most of the views in there is about mainly privacy or protection or allowing people to, for example, using this data cooperative and trust and stewardship and so on. So I find that there is a lot of hype on this, on the one hand. On the other hand, for example, I had a quick chat, I remember last year with Jaron Lanier about the use of this stewardship and so on. And I'm quite agnostic, right, as an economist, but I wanted to know your views, for example, of are we just including a further layer of control between the individual and the large platforms or whomever we want to protect the individual from, and how to ensure that this does not happen, even with a little bit of a view on economic justice, rather than only GDPR related stuff that mainly relate about protection and privacy and minimization, as you were saying, or control or portability or and so on. So how can we reconcile the two and avoid possibly a more complicated and undemocratic way of data governance? Thank you.
Thanks. Juan, do you want to start? And maybe keep it to 2 or 3 minutes if you can.
That's going to be very difficult because there were such great questions with such great depth. So Noor, obviously, I mean, I'm a great fan of your work on the democratization of AI, and I think I look forward to discuss this further. I guess in terms of like, if I had to almost like give a tweet long description of the situation or why we see this decline in diversity, I think it comes down to the fact that I guess the technologies that have become dominant are the ones that solve the use cases for tech companies with lots of money. And basically these tech companies are hiring all of the smart people, all of the PhDs coming from the best universities. And then basically this is sucking the air out of the ecosystem. So actually other trajectories don't really have the brain power to be sustained. And obviously this creates network effects, right? Because then you say, you have more advances within deep learning. People are investing on the infrastructure that complements deep learning. We have a Simone, it's a really recent really cool paper on semiconductors, which are almost like adapted for deep learning use cases. You get like more data being created around deep learning. So in a way, it creates this winner takes all style situation where it becomes dominant. Obviously, the question is, what can we do, I guess, to fight against that if we would like to preserve diversity? I think a lot of this is going to be around actually thinking about how can the public sector almost like lever like its funding to support like alternative trajectories. How can we increase the supply of people with the skills to develop these technologies, and also the diversity of those groups, because more inclusive research workforces are probably going to contribute to more diverse AI trajectories. And then also like complementary interventions around regulation of how data can be used, even environmental regulation to, I guess, maybe discourage the adoption of like environmentally sustainable in many ways deep learning systems and so forth. So yeah, it's one of these, not a silver bullet, but many complementary interventions, almost like a policy diversity to contribute to drive research diversity. Then the question from Ashish, I guess, I mean, so many like things I could pick up on there. You know, obviously there's like a question around bias in what we're looking for in our paper, you know, and the fact that we are only like considering one almost like signal of corporate activity around AI, you know, which is those that publish. It would be great to look at other things, like obviously look at the business piece, like, and use things like Crunchbase. We're very interested in using things like open source data to look at maybe what technologies are being developed and maybe what developers in what industries are using, maybe almost like open source frameworks which are associated to different AI methods, and almost like infer from that the methods that the companies are using. We're very interested in using online job ad data to look at the skills that businesses are recruiting. Insofar they suggest they tell us something about the technologies they're using. So yeah, I mean, it would be great to discuss that. And you know, if anyone has internal like company data to do like an in-depth case study of how companies are using these methods, that would be great. Maybe like just another question, like a final point I wanted to make is, I think it was a great point you were making before about how the private sector, how companies can balance exploitation of like today's opportunities and exploration of new opportunities, and how I think I was very excited, I guess, when you said, okay, actually, then what you do is go and work with academic researchers and maybe go outside of your circle to talk with people who might give you almost like an external perspective. And I guess one of the areas for concern from our work is that actually it feels like those external perspectives are becoming more homogeneous, because researchers in the best universities, in the best academic departments, especially those that maybe are collaborating more with tech companies, or have more graduates going to tech companies actually are becoming very similar to the insiders, and we might see a bit of a almost like decline in the imagination of the whole research ecosystem that make it possible to do that, help businesses do that more blue skies thinking. I guess with many more things I would like to say, and I'm taking some notes. Maybe I'll send them to you later in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Juan. Beatrice, do you want to have a reply to any comments?
Yeah, I share all these concerns, and there's an anecdote that is often told when recounting the many histories of the AI winter. So the famous AI winter of the 70s is like the drying up of funds at DARPA in relation to AI, that they shift from the model of funding people to the model of funding projects. And it's an anecdote that in a way also speaks volume of how homogeneity often comes from instrumentalization of certain paths of research. And so by instrumentalization, I also mean like looking for direct applications and utility, understood in a broad possible sense. So I don't know if we live in still, or if we ever live in the world that we can fund people and not projects, but it's a nice thought to entertain.
Thanks, Beatrice. Katja, do you want to reply to any comment, and maybe Maria's comment?
Yeah, sure. I'll keep, because I agree with everything that Beatrice and Juan just said. So I'll just reply to Maria's question. So that I completely agree that the data steward conversation, or actually the whole sort of alternative data governance debate, is currently a bit muddled, actually. And I think there's a lot of definitional issues with different groups calling different things, like data trust versus data commons versus data. So like there's all these sort of debates going on, and I don't think really a sort of community agreement on what some of it means. Well, I agree with some of them at risk being very much in the realm of just adding yet another intermediary into a system where there is enough intermediaries as it is, that might do a bit more to protect people's privacy rights. In some cases, which can be helpful, but I think is a bit of a myopic view. Sometimes we're a bit too concerned about data protection alone in these equations, when it's a much bigger debate, right? About fundamental power, like disbalances in the sort of digital economy that you wouldn't address through these ways. It could help, but wouldn't solve the issue. Similarly, a bit of these ideas about monetizing data of individuals, these sort of data broker models that could help people. So that's something that I think is a complicated debate, and someone still out there has a role to play to kind of do a good classification of what all these different models are, and to sort of bring some agreement on what they mean. What I do think is interesting, what we're trying to propose a bit in this paper, is to look at getting that balance, I guess, between centralization and decentralization, right? Because there are a lot of solutions that are out there that don't require this sort of introduction of a new intermediary, but they could. So you would be in direct, I don't know, you could be like in direct contact with sort of, I own my data, I can share it on my own terms. And there's a lot of things in the self-sovereign identity space that get quite technical, not probably people's radar, but that could be very interesting there. But what we would need is quite bold, I guess, governance models to sit alongside that, because these kind of systems could never, I think, really truly scale or truly get interesting if you don't have they say that a sort of central structure in place to instill trust into the system, because it won't self-govern itself. So there's maybe a little bit of a long story, but I think there are models where you could maybe not introduce something new like this, or to someone to set the rules for you in your name, but where you would have a trusted actor in place, most likely then a government or a sort of independent government funded body, let's say, that could help at least set the rules of the game, but then you can play it on your own terms. But yeah, it's maybe a bit of a long discussion, but it's I think it's a very good point, a very good question, because I do think we're at risk of maybe picking one of these and then just repeating the same problem again, where you'll get a couple cemented sort of structures in place that don't actually empower people all that much.
Thanks so much. Unfortunately, we almost running out of time, and we had the last presentation by Tommaso of the work we did as a SPRU team, that he's going to present a reflection on the future. But maybe before closing the discussion, I want to maybe repeat Adrian's question that maybe all of you could reply in the chat, because I think that's a quite thought-provoking and interesting ideas. What advice, if any, does the panel and Ed would have regarding sabotaging AI, thinking about lack of reliable, legitimate institution and so on and so forth? So I think that's a very interesting question, and I'd really like to have the thought of everyone on that. So I'm going to repost it, and on that I'm going to leave the floor to Tommaso Charlie, who will talk a little bit about the SPRU AI group and a few of us thinking about what can be worked on in the future of AI in STI. Thanks. Tommaso, we cannot hear you.
Maybe because I should unmute myself. I think it works better now. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
All right. Can you see the right one or the wrong one?
The right one. We can see the full. Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry, I always get confused with these PPTs. Okay, so I think, thank you so much for giving us space to present some of the reflections that we did in a very short work, looking at some of the research that the JRC has done on artificial intelligence and its impact on the economy. Now, I must say, as a premise, that it feels a little bit like I don't know. It feels weird for me to come after all these amazing recounts about AI and where it has been, where it is going, its relation to imagination, different relation with the economy, and different projections about how the research is doing and how it is becoming narrower. So I think, yeah, take this as a sort of not a conclusive presentation, but take this as a sort of probably opening up some questions in terms of what has been already discussed. Now, we go to the next slides very quickly. I'm going to present again, as I mentioned, this is work done particularly looking at what the JRC has done in mapping AI and its impact on the economy. So we're looking at some of the issues which we think, looking at the literature and the work that has been done so far, are still quite open. Some of them have been discussed, but I think there's a few more streams to be discussed. Potential directions for AI research, just to stimulate a little bit more imagination. But honestly, I mean, I think in my role, becoming more and more as a project administrator, like rather than a researcher, my imagination is really shrinked quite a lot. So I think I'll follow at the paradigm here, which is that imagination is somewhere up there and closed and not really used in this particular presentation. And then I think I will conclude with a couple of points which might be useful for discussion, and probably we don't have time for discussion. Four areas of open issues that we thought are particularly relevant. First of all, definition. I think we had the discussion a little bit with Ed telling us about the little bit of the story of AI in this presentation and in earlier presentations. But I think there's still quite a lot of openness in terms of what AI is and how different people look at what AI is, whether it is one thing, whether it is one technology, whether it is a cluster of technologies, how we can use these definitions. And this is all important because depending on which definitions we use, then we define our set of keywords to find the data that we want in order to understand and map AI in whatever data set. And this will also guide what kind of impact we find. So what we define as AI, is obviously crucial and it's probably not very clear. And I think, as Fred would say, there's still lots of doubts among information scientists themselves about what AI might be these days. And there's this second sort of mantra which hasn't appeared today, and I think this is a good sign that AI might be actually general purpose technology. And there's actually quite a lot of discussion which shows that AI is not a general purpose technology. And I think Simone would have much more to say here. I think he just put out a paper in which he nicely explains why AI is not a GPT. But I can't remember how he actually defines it. But Simone, you can tell us a bit more. But basically, not a GPT. The second point is about the data, which is obviously linked to the definition. But there is a limitation to what patents and publication can tell us. And of course, they tell us about the frontier of research, some of the frontier of innovation. But I think, as Ashish mentioned, and then Juan replied, there's much more than publication and patents. And obviously, Juan and team have been doing a little bit of work. Actually, I mean, not a little bit, but quite substantial work on other data sets such as GitHub, Crunchbase. There's a lot more to be learned than what we can see if we want to really understand what is the frontier of AI than in publication and data. So perhaps I think it is time to move beyond those data sets which can be useful. Another source of information which is really crucial, and I think someone in the audience here using is Scraping the Web, something that Plus AI has been doing as well, and looking at what companies are actually doing in relation to AI. Now, why this is important? This is very important, we think, if you look at the third point, which is looking at sectors and the relation between AI and different sectors, and particularly looking at the impact, which is the fourth point. Because one thing that we seem to not know very well, and not being able to capture, looking at some of the main data we use, such as publication and patents, is what aspect of sectors and firms we actually capture. First of all, we know that there's a lot of sectors that produce technologies such as AI, and a lot of sectors that use technologies. And I think we know that since Pavid quite clearly. So just focusing on the innovation itself is problematic if you want to understand the impact. And the other thing is that these technologies, as somebody said earlier, and as I think Ed clearly presented in his lecture, are transforming companies. And it's probably time to understand better how they transform these companies in order to understand what is the impact of AI on economies. And this comes to the third point. There seems to be a little bit of linking to what Ed's lecture, lack of imagination, in the sense that we seem to be driven by sort of big data streetlight effect. This is the data we have, and this is a bit of the argument that actually I already said. This is the data that we have, so this is the data that we use, and this is what we seem to find, not because we focus on the problem, but because we focus on the information that we have available. So it might be better probably to take a step back from all this data and think a little bit more imaginatively, probably more with case studies as well, and trying to understand in a more granular way the different ways in which AI is impacting the economy, which goes at very different levels. Some of them which are linked, but obviously we think at skills, tasks, structure of companies, international trade, organization of global value chains. It's so related and it's so complex that I think it's probably time to look at. We think it's very time to look at more in details. So potential direction of future research, and here again, apologies. I mean, lots of these would be very familiar to many of you. Better understand what are the trajectories that AI is following, not only in terms of science and technologies, but also in terms of what companies are doing, what they are using, what tasks, how tasks are changing, how skills are changing, the relation between the humans and the robots. Looking at how ethical aspects, as have been discussed now, influence this research, because it's not only the impact of AI and what ethical implication it has, but it's also the implication of those ethical aspects, as the work of Fred on automation Freddie Dad in the Deep Transition Project on Automation has shown that research might change because there are political movements and or sabotage, as Edina was saying, that might divert the trajectories of research innovation. And understanding a little bit more what is happening in the industries in terms of profiling firms and sectors and what they're doing. And this obviously leads us to a little bit better understanding of what might be the impact of AI. Particularly, we think it's crucial to look at the future of work. Here as well, Ed has mentioned quite that there might be some differences between early technological revolutions and what AI might bring for the future of work. And we really know very little now. I mean, there's a lot of people working on that, just not denying that there's no work, but then there's more work which is needed. Implication for societal challenges. Obviously, I'm putting the SDGs here, but there's many more other societal challenges that we have to take into account. And something that has been discussed already by Kathy and others, which is better understanding of the value that the data is creating and how these values distributed. I think Ed had a very relevant point about the marginal value of one single data point. But I think there's more than that. There is also the biases that these data can provide. You know, not everybody leave the same traces in the internet, so not everybody is equally represented, as we know, and this creates also biases in terms of the understanding of societies that we have. So just to conclude, a very patchy and probably already well-known presentation here, some take-home messages here. The first one, is it a good moment to step back and reflect a little bit about what AI is, looking at specifically some sectors, some firms, some industries, what people, firms are doing, including improved ways of capturing AI producers and adopters, because I think we're totally missing out with respect to adopters. We're looking mainly at producers, which is again a biased view. Looking at AI's development in relation to complementary technologies. We cannot study AI in itself. We have to study the complement not only with labor, but with other technologies. Reflecting on the barriers of diffusion of AI and diffusion which are both social and ethical and geographical, and what might be the impact of AI in different contexts. So we think there might be quite a lot of space to design projects now which are a little bit more interdisciplinary and which combine different ways of looking at AI a little bit as a discussion today has shown. It might be a good time to come together for sort of work out things rather than presenting ideas, actually trying to put out a program which looks at AI from different perspectives and different methods. And I think I stop here. Thanks a lot for listening. Apologies for opening only questions. And in this case, I think your answers are very welcome. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. And well, if you have any question, I would suggest you could put them in the chat to write to us, as we're going to close the session soon. So the session will close in about five minutes or so, so we can still be connected and discuss questions in the chats. But as some final comments, I would like to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to thank especially Ed for giving the lecture in the first part, and also all our panelists, Juan, Katia, and Beatrice. Thank as well Simone and Aristea and Yvonne, who helped us to actually put the event together. And I'm really happy to be part of SPRU and the business school, and that we have those AI meetings and loads of people to exchange with, as you saw the thinking with Tommaso, Simone, and Maria. So I'd like to thank everyone again. It's been fantastic for us. And as I said, we're going to keep the chat open for 5 minutes for people who want to discuss as well or ask questions on the final presentation. But thank you very much, everyone.